Hello and welcome to today's podcast, where we're going to talk about the theory of differential association. Those of you who watch our views regularly will know that a few weeks ago we did a vodcast on Cressy's fraud triangle. Well, today I'm joined again by Dr. Peter Tickner, and we're going to look at the theory of differential association. Before we get into that, Peter, perhaps if you could just say a bit about yourself for the viewers.
Right, Mark. Well, I was a practitioner for 40 years, an auditor and a fraud investigator for my entire career, ending up as the chief auditor at the Metropolitan Police for 14 years. When I retired from that, I took up consultancy and academic studies, and thanks to your kind assistance, achieved my doctorate earlier this year, specialising in fraud. As part of that, I've had a keen interest in the history of fraud anyway, and have researched a number of areas, including Cressy's fraud triangle, which we covered before. And during the course of that, one can't get very far without talking about Sutherland and looking into Edwin Sutherland and his theories, one of the leading criminologists of the 20th century.
Yes. Now, Edward Sutherland is considered almost the father of white-collar crime, and one of the kind of central theories that underpins some of the explanations around that is differential association. Perhaps if we could just start by explaining what that theory actually outlines.
Right. Well, in broad terms, differential association theory is the theory that people that commit crime have associated with a group of people who are similar-minded and have learnt from them how crime is committed. And then they form a kind of peer group of people of similar like-minded criminals, learning skills from each other until they become skilled enough to commit the crimes themselves. So its differential association theory is largely that a group of people differentiates themselves from other groups in society for the purposes of criminology. There's more, for committing crime. There's more to it than that, of course, because you could argue that any professional group differentially associates by its nature. But what Sutherland was doing was looking at a world where nobody saw criminals as being in any way organised or in any way something to do with the kind of values that you associate with the profession or anything else.
Could you tell us a bit about how Sutherland developed that theory? I know you've been delving into some of the literature and some of the other writers he worked with, and I know you've got some fascinating insights on that.
Well, I hope so. Sutherland started, he was an academic most of his life. He gained his PhD in 1913, so it was just about the start of the First World War. And he gained it in sociology and economics, but he decided to pursue the sociology side more than the economics. And he was always interested in criminology and criminals. It was something that fascinated him from an early stage. And by 1924, he produced a handbook of criminology. In fact, the Handbook of Criminology still exists today in whatever edition it's now on. But this was the first kind of organised book about criminological theory and what it all stands for and where it's all coming from. But Sutherland realised when he was doing it that most criminologists were in two schools of thought. And he thought they were mistaken. He thought there was more to it than they were seeing. And the two schools of thought that they were into, they either thought that criminals were criminals because of their social class, in other words, because they came from poverty or poor communities or particular racial groups, and therefore they were more likely to commit crime, or people who thought it was some kind of physiological or psychological disturbance. So they either thought they were people who were low intelligence, or there were people who were inclined to poor behaviour because they had some kind of mania or some kind of psychological condition. But these were the only two groups of theories, really, about why people committed crime. And it was always associated with the lower classes. It was always associated with people who were from deprived backgrounds rather than anybody who was middle or upper class. So Sutherland felt that people had missed a trick here, and they were really looking at the wrong things to define what made a criminal. And to that end, a colleague of his, a doctor who specialised in, it was a cross between an academic and he wrote books about hobos and tramps and venereal disease and rather unsavoury subjects. But he also lived amongst these people, this particular character, and he was once described in a book as the king of the hobos. But he knew Sutherland, and he came across a criminal, a reformed drug addict of a criminal, who he knew as Harry Bennett. And Bennett was trying to find honest work and proved to be highly intelligent and clearly quite good at academic stuff. So this guy used him in some of his background academic research and recommended him to Sutherland as somebody he could usefully employ to work on some of his academic work on criminology, because he was a criminal, but an intelligent criminal who you could communicate with. Sutherland met him and agreed, and the first character, the King of the Hobos, agreed to provide a sum of money for research using this guy as the assistant. Sutherland realized after talking to this guy, who he knew as Broadway Jones, not as Harry Bennett, he thought Broadway Jones was an alias, but I'll come to that in a minute. But he knew him as Broadway Jones, and he eventually decided it'd be a very good idea if Broadway Jones wrote about how criminals are organized, how they're not the lowlifes and the poor and the whatever that everybody thought they were, but in actual fact, there's a whole criminal fraternity and profession out there that people are just unaware of. In fact, fun enough, I think the great Harry Houdini did something similar in 1906, but I don't like to annoy people on that. Houdini was not quite interesting. He wrote mainly about burglary and the profession of burglary. But anyway, leave that aside. So Sutherland, for as in about a 5-year period from about 1930, he worked with this guy and got him to write down his thoughts about how criminals do their business. Sutherland would give him questions and pose him ideas, but the guy would just sit there and write. And then Sutherland would take his work and re-edit it and go back to him and talk to him about it. And then he paid him a fee every month from the university for doing this work. And this was during the Great Depression, of course. You've got to bear in mind, work was hard to get at the time as well. So he was doing a social service, as far as he saw it, for this guy, as well as anything else. But he gradually realized that, they had a book. There was a book there, and it became a book called The Professional Thief by a Professional Thief. Now, how much the professional thief actually wrote and how much is Sutherland's interpretation of what the thief said to him or the scribblings between them is a moot point. At the time when the book was published, he called the professional thief Chick Conwell, a rather obvious alias for a con man, and said that Chick Conwell mainly thieved in the 1920s. So the book was about thieving in the 1920s, but was now reformed, but had died in 1933, shortly before this book, which was published eventually in 1937, came out. That, I'm sorry to tell you, was a lie. You don't expect academics to lie, but there you go. We know it's a lie because Sutherland's papers were later researched by another academic in 1973, who found that Chick Conwell, Broadway Jones, was alive and well, in fact, after Sutherland died and outlived Sutherland. That aside, at the time when Sutherland was producing The Professional Thief, he was concerned about the backlash, understandably, because it was a book that a book like that had never been written before. It was quite unique. A professional thief telling you how he did it, what he did, where he did what he did, who he met with, who the people were that thieved, how they did the fix with the police, how corrupt public officials were. Nobody had dared to put that in print before. You get odd newspaper stories, but nothing as, from the inside as this was. And he had a lot of trouble getting the book published, which is one of the reasons why I think he decided that the guy had to be dead in order to have the book published. But eventually he got the book published, and the publishers, before they published it, wanted proof that the guy had given him permission to reproduce his words, because as you do, as we all know, when we're in the academic world, you've got to have authenticity about what you're producing, or you've got to give it credit to where it's due. So of course he said, oh, well, I've got a paper somewhere telling me that the guy gave me permission, but of course he hadn't. So he then wrote to Barnaby Jones and said, look, I said you died 4 years ago. Can you make up a note from 4 years ago? Now, that's not what I call academic integrity by a man who was the son of a Baptist minister. But Jones, being a good con man, wrote back with 2 notes. He said, right, here's one from me as Broadway Jones, and here's another one from me under another name. In case I don't believe that name, you can use that letter. And dated them both from 1933. The relationship between Sutherland and his con man for the professional thief was a little dodgy, to say the least. Not sure it'd pass ethical committee scrutiny in today's world at all.
Not at all. Not at all.
They also became firm friends, by the way, after that, and socialised a lot. Even worse.
Could you tell us a bit about how the theory of differential association?
Yeah. That's the point I was coming to.
Okay. Because
of what Jones was telling him and what he put in the book, Sutherland thought, well, this is just like a profession. It's got all the characteristics that the hallmarks we offer to a lawyer or a doctor or any other profession that we see. And they're not all low lifes. This isn't a group of people that are down at the bottom of the food chain. These are people who could pass for any you or I in the street who are committing these crimes.
Mm-hmm.
So he then talks tentatively at the end of this book. There's 2 pages where he says, I believe it's their differential association that has led them down this route. They've met with people who are similarly minded. They know each other. They know how to recognize the signs of knowing that they're a fellow professional thief. And that keeps their differential association apart from the rest of us. And it's what leads them down the route of continuing to thieve. That was his first mention of it. And he pondered this long and hard after the book came out. And in 1939 or thereabouts, he produced a paper with his differential association theory of criminology. And what he's really doing is he's saying, look, establishment, you're trying to say it's all the poor people, it's all the slum people, it's all the people who are mentally deficient, it's all the people who've got big psychological problems. I'm telling you, there's a whole group of criminals out there who haven't got those issues necessarily, or they're just a side issue to the reason why they commit their crimes. So this is where Sutherland was coming from. He was a wake-up call to the academe and to the professions that you're not seeing criminality as it really is. So I'm sure that's what was driving Sutherland on. And it has a direct link with what he then did on white-collar crime.
Fascinating. Now, there's been a lot of criticisms of differential association theory. Could you talk us through some of those? And I think you hold some of those criticisms as well. I might be wrong.
Well, I think you've got to see it in context. He was writing at a time when nobody was seeing beyond the theories they were looking at. It had to be psychological. It had to be criminally poor. He believed that Chick Conwell, he was a very good con man, or Broadway Jones, or Harry Bennett, which is what he called himself when he went to prison, but that wasn't his name either. What research shows is that Jones had persuaded Sutherland that he came from a middle class background, but had got into drugs and then drifted into the life of crime. However, the truth of the matter is he didn't come from an upper middle class background. He taught himself to sound like somebody from upper middle class because he was a con man. He was a drug addict most of his life, and he did the cons to feed his drug addict habit. And Sutherland glossed over his drug addiction in writing the book. He refers to it. He refers to him being a reformed drug addict at the start. He makes a couple of references to people who commit crimes, often doing it to feed drug habits. But he makes no link back to the person he's relying on for that book. And when he wrote his differential association theory, he's already drifting towards, I'm going to pick up on white-collar crime. He's not thinking in terms of people and drug addicts. He's thinking in terms of criminals or intelligent criminals who decide to become criminals. So he's deliberately blocking off something that was fundamentally true about the person he was using as his role model for differential association. So that's one issue. Another issue is it is stuck in time. We now know a lot more about how people behave than we did then. And I think with that hindsight of greater knowledge, even in the 1970s, they were challenging many of the ideas then. And even his greatest defender, Donald Cressy, who defended him most of his life, carried on publishing the criminology book for Sutherland after Sutherland died. Ironically, they both died suddenly and unexpectedly in similar ways. It just and at the same sort of age. One of those very odd things that gets me quite worried. All these academics that keep on dropping dead all over the place. but anyway, so even Cressy recognised that Sutherland's theories on differential association didn't really fit every circumstance, and were another way at looking at things, and were a whole avenue to open up, but are not the answer to why people commit crimes. And I think that's the thing. It fundamentally changed the way criminologists thought. It led to the development of the theory about white-collar crime, which again was a unique thing that we will always associate Sutherland with. But Sutherland was on a crusade, and he allowed that crusade to warp his judgment, I would suggest.
Yeah. It's interesting because if we imagine a corrupt organization and a new employee joining it, sort of, can we imagine that person, that new employee, is going to kind of join that organization and become a criminal? And it's an interesting sort of idea. I mean, what would most people do? Obviously, you also have a wide range of experience of finding corrupt cultures. That's not in a complete organization, but certainly in departments or, little groups within organizations. What can you say about that, Peter, from your experience?
Well, I think it's a general thing in society, and particularly Western society, that we are, and certainly in the UK, that when you join an organization as a junior member of it, or whatever that organization might be, you try to adopt its social norms and values. Now, if those social norms and values are not good, then you have to be quite a strong-minded person not to drift into starting to adopt them. Some people are strong enough not to adopt them, and the moral outrage they feel about those things will lead them either to leave the organization or to try and change the organization. And I've known many people in the police like that, were very, very morally, they didn't join the police because they wanted to be corrupt. They joined the police because they wanted to do the right thing for society. And they were some of my best friends in the police. But equally, I've known of groups that become corrupted, and we can go back to the corruption of the Metropolitan Police in the 70s and the aftermath of it, because in the 70s, a lot of newspapers were finding that detectives in Soho and the West End were associating with people who ran prostitutes, who ran gambling clubs, and who were organised crime. And in fact, the whole of some detective sections became corrupted by this. There were standing jokes about parts of Scotland Yard where you could turn up in the old Scotland Yard and watch the brown envelopes being dished out on a Friday afternoon to all the detectives with their particular cut of the cash from whichever villain was paying them off that week. And it's what led Sir Kenneth Newman when he took over the police, and I think he was questioned in a famous interview, what is your plan for the Metropolitan Police? And he replied in a moment of cynical sarcasm, to catch more criminals than we employ. But one of the consequences of all the attempts to deal with corruption in the 70s, apart from the setting up of an anti-corruption team, which they'd not had before, the so-called A10, referred to in the old film The Sweeney. If you ever watch episodes of The Sweeney, every now and again, Jack Regan's worried about being pounced on by A10. Well, that was the anti-corruption squad of its day. And that developed and became what I knew when I first arrived at the Met as CIB. But in those days, it had been a very reactive anti-corruption thing. It hadn't looked for proactively to prevent corruption. So because of that, corruption still developed. There was one detective team, I remember, where every single detective in the team ended up suspended. And we're talking about 30-odd officers accused of being involved in parceling out the proceeds of armed robberies amongst themselves. Not all were, clearly. But the fact remained, the culture was such that nobody had said anything about it. And it hadn't come to light for anybody who worked in the unit. People had gone to the unit. If they found they didn't like the behaviour, they'd simply moved out and gone and done their detecting somewhere else. Nobody had said, oh, I think this is wrong. And I think, very few people did that. And I was lucky that I knew a few of the people who would do that. And so culturally, once an organisation gets into that kind of a warp, it's very difficult to pull yourself back out of it.
It is. It's interesting you mentioned that, because I've done some research with colleagues on cash for crash fraud. And we found strong family cultures, extended families. We found some workplace cultures where individuals had been brought together and had become accustomed to cash for crash as a normal and legitimate means to make some money, and become normalized in those groups. and certainly I could see, looking at those particular groups, that differential association, had an important part to play in explaining why those individuals became involved. So I think clearly it does have some relevance in certain contexts. But that poses the central question: how do you change a culture? You've hinted on some of the things obviously the Metropolitan Police have done. Again, from your experience, Peter, when you have seen this in action, what is the best way for an organisation to try and change those cultures?
Well, I think the starting point is actually at the very top. It's getting the leaders to acknowledge the problem and making public statements about what they find unacceptable, and then having the processes and the systems to back that up, to educate people about what is appropriate and what isn't. I mean, a very good example, when I joined the Met, detectives at the rank of superintendent and above did not have to have their expenses checked by anybody. They could just claim them each week. But below that rank, the detective had to get their expenses certified by a more senior officer. So it was the generally accepted norm that the average detective superintendent would claim several meals a week, whether or not he had them, because he could just put them down on a piece of paper and be paid for them. And that kind of behavior had become accepted. Nobody had challenged that, well, hang on, this is public funds, why are we doing this? And the same thing happened with the Amex card scandal, which I was very much involved in. I'd noticed we had somebody, an informant, who reported to us in way back in 2004 that somebody was fiddling their corporate credit cards, and he was a police protection officer. They knew he was fiddling it because he'd put in a load of Spanish receipts filled in the wrong way around. This person was Spanish and knew damn well that the receipts had obviously been faked back in the UK. So we got on to him, and at the time got my audit department to pull in a number of, there was only a small number of credit cards in the Met Police at the time. Most of them were in protection officers and, diplomat protection and royalty protection, rather than in the general milieu of detectives. So we called in those cards, and we found a lot of poor practices. We found about 6 or 7 clear frauds, and about 80 or 90 officers who were simply doing things that were unacceptable, and they just didn't seem to understand it was unacceptable. So we went to great lengths to give them training and knowledge about what was right. We didn't hit them all over the head. We said, look, stop now and it'll be all right. Anyway, sadly for me, things went awry, because in 2005, we had that dreadful business in the summer of the London tube bombings. That tore the Met apart, and it meant that almost every detective was diverted to counter-terrorism work. And those of us who had backroom functions found ourselves filling in support, lending a staff to help support bits of the organisation so it could carry on functioning in a normal way the rest of the time. And audits and fraud were the last thing on my agenda at the time. But when the furore died down, I went back in 2006 to have another look at what was going on. And we discovered to our horror that because of the need to do the counter-terrorism work quickly, they'd dished out over 1,000 Amex cards to police officers, just go off and do whatever they had to do. But they'd forgotten to ask them to account for what they were spending on it. So we pointed this out, and there was a bit of a hoo-ha for a year or so over this. And I remember the deputy head of counter-terrorism telling me she had more important things to do than worry about the finances. And I entirely accept that. But the fact remained, the culture wasn't dealt with, and it started to bubble up. So I did the only sensible thing. I pulled in all the expenses claims of all the senior police officers and started to look at them. And they, of course, then complained to the police authority and the chief executive that their chief auditor was being a complete pain. And that said, well, why is he being a complete pain? Well, he's challenging our expenses. Is there anything wrong with them? No, but we seem to have got an awful lot of expenses money going out we didn't know about. And at that point, even the commissioner woke up to the fact there might be a problem. And they then rounded on me and said I hadn't told them there was a problem, which is typical of what policemen do. They blame the auditor. In fact, it's most organisations blame the auditor when it goes wrong. And then we discovered, that over 1,000 detectives have been not accounting for their expenditure at all. And all the time, since the business that had happened. So We organised a system whereby the finance department pulled in huge wads of paperwork. The commissioner told every detective they had to account for their spend, whether they liked it or not. And miraculously, about £200,000 in cash was repaid to the police when people said they accidentally borrowed it on their corporate card by mistake. And they couldn't imagine how it had happened, but they wanted to pay the money back before we looked at the records. that was the start. And then the paperwork came in and they divided it up into those that looked all right, those that looked a bit dodgy, and those that looked very dodgy. And then the bit dodgy and the very dodgy was sent to me. And I then had my entire department of fraud investigators, all 9 of them, plus spare auditors I could spare from the audit side, just spent an entire year just going through this, classifying it as fraud, nearly fraud, words of advice. Words of advice, it was given to the professional standards people, and they went and found the police officer and said, don't do this again. When it was nearly fraud, they looked at it and did nothing. And when we said it was fraud, they looked at it and largely did nothing. But for a very small proportion, they were prosecuted and sent to prison. And there were some serious cases amongst it. But the knock-on effect across London, I mean, the image of the police went downhill. Every police authority meeting in different London boroughs, the first item on the agenda was, can we trust our detectives? So by people behaving like this, thinking, oh, well, it's just a cultural thing, you know, that corporate-wise, if they're giving us a card, we'll just use it on what we like while we're doing our work. They'd ended up undermining public confidence in the police. I mean, it had an enormous knock-on effect. So because of that, and because the scandal then broke in the national press, it was quite funny. I got asked at a police authority meeting that I was not to say anything that might trigger press interest. It was all going fine until a member of the opposition of the police authority looked at me and said, would you say this was fraud, Peter? And before I could stop myself, I said, yes. And all hell broke out with TV cameras reeling the works. But in the end, it did the Met a favour. It got it sorted out. We changed corporate card. We changed the rules. Detectives knew that they couldn't do that in future. And the real bad ones were fished out as a consequence of their actions. So, I mean, I've often felt that you can often judge the quality of an individual's behaviour by what they do with their expenses. If they're a major abuser of expenses, it says an awful lot about their attitude in their work generally. Yeah. So for me, it was a nice trigger to be able to use to get rid of some of the dodgier detectives, and to get, you know, and to enable and we then had we used a thing called, the National Audit Office had at the time, called Changing Organisational Cultures. Doesn't really exist now, but it was a good package of measures you could take to the top of the office and sit people around the table and say, do you think this behaviour is right? You know, and the police officers are very good about what's morally right or wrong and what the law is, but then getting them to think about their own actions. You know, would you think that was right or wrong? And I literally sat down with the commissioner and his senior management team, and we took them through it. And it was quite amusing to see the commissioner going, oh no, this is wrong, isn't it? This is, you know, and you think, well, you're the most senior police officer in the country. So it was, yeah, I think if you get the culture right, you can change. I'm not saying the Met is right now. I mean, it's got a great commissioner at the moment. I know Cressida very well. She's a great person. And previous commissioner, Bernard Howe, great person as well. And they would have done their best to try and improve the Met. But any large organisation, as I've said in other forums, any large organisation, you're going to have a level of abuse going on. And the police are just a reflection of society. And the same is true of any other large organisation. Universities the same. There will be people there who are abusing their position. There'll be people there who are taking advantage of things. And all you can do is try and find the best way of dealing with that. I mean, differential association theory could apply equally to the police. You could say that, you know, detectives were a culture to themselves. And once they start to adopt the wrong values, then there can be an issue. But I think there's much more to it than that. But it is about culture. You're quite right.
Well, that's fascinating. And you touched upon something that we developed in another piece of research, what we call the corruptor pathogen, the importance of individuals who are, you know, very corrupt, who kind of recruit others into their schemes. We wrote an article about that, and perhaps we'll do a podcast on that in the future. I think we'll wrap it up there. Is there anything else, Peter, you'd like to say before we end this podcast?
Not really, Mark. I suppose there is. Well, just to say that Sutherland deserves credit for alerting the world to everything that he did. However, His obsession with white-collar crime was more to do with his battle with the corporate establishment than it was to do with academic research, and that's the only thing I would say.
Okay. And perhaps we can do something on that in the future. I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah.
But for today, for our kind of normal length of podcast, we'll end it there. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Mark.
And we'll see you again all soon.
All being well.